In this module, we're going to talk about what I call formula-driven development. Now, formula-driven development is something I've been employing throughout this entire course. You may have noticed that I do things differently, that I prefer formulas over VBA in these cases. This is really at the core of what formula-driven development is. It does require us to think differently about how we've been developing with Excel. So let's talk about what I would call classic Excel development. Classical development is the way that we learned, either professionally through on-the-job training, or sometimes we learned how to do it this way in school. So I used to work for a graduate school, and I know based off of their VBA and Excel modeling courses that they do this type of development, and you've probably seen it before. So the basics behind it is that data is disconnected. And by disconnected, I mean it doesn't automatically change and flow through the model as we've built it. So you may think of the past examples we've built. If the data in the back end changes, it bubbles up through the model. But in classical development, we're told to develop one of two ways, or both. We're told to develop with pivot tables, or with VBA, or with both. So in the case of a pivot table, if you update the back-end data, you still need to update the pivot table. There's a few ways to do this. You could do it manually, or you can have some VBA automatically do it when you look at a certain tab. The point is that it gets messy, and anyone who's debugged a program like this knows that that disconnection causes a lot of issues because it's hard to figure out the state of what you're looking at. Are you looking at the latest data? Are you looking at updated data? Do you need to update it several times just to be sure? It's a real pain. The second manifestation of this is that of the Run button. So over here I have a picture of a button that says Run Model. We've all seen things like this most likely. They are the buttons that go to VBA to tell it to churn something out. So this is the very common development I see in Excel Decision Support System and dashboard books. It says, hey, hit a button, take some data input, do something to it, and then spit it out, and then hopefully a chart is linked to that, or you use VBA to relink the chart. So one of the many problems with this method, this VBA-heavy method, is that there's actually a lot of redundancy in it. So often it requires you to hook up a chart again and make sure that the colors are correct. There's no reliability in it. And just to drive this point home, when I used to work for one of the professional services firms, I was handed a model that was modeling staff growth, and the way it was built was that the user, through a whole bunch of user forms, would input the data, and then they would hit a Run button, and then you hope to God that a response would come up. Usually what would happen, if you had a lot of programs open, was that Excel would start churning, and then it would fade to white, and then you wouldn't want to click because it would say, hey, would you like to wait for Excel to respond, and you weren't really sure, and you would hope that in a meeting after about 5 minutes it returns something. So this is not the dynamic that we like. And after I moved to formula-driven development with that model, I reduced the time it took to calculate to about 20 seconds. So it went from about 5 to 6 minutes to 20 seconds, and it produced the same results. So in the classical method, the data is disconnected, and there's a lot of VBA, and it's always slow. And I say it's always kind of broken because when you hit Run, sometimes the screen fades to white, and you really hope that it's going to work, but you're not sure. So it's in this state of unknown, much like Schrodinger's cat. So we don't really like that type of development. And I have other courses where I talk about using VBA, but I think it's very important to understand formula-driven development first. So as we start this next part of modules, we're going to be focusing very heavily on what it means to be formula-driven. So here are the tenets that I bring up. And so when I talk about tenets, I talk about goals. These are the things that we aspire to achieve. They're not necessarily rules, but they're a way of thinking to guide us. So the first thing is that we're always going to prefer formulas over VBA. And the next thing is we're always going to try to be doing more with less. Sometimes we have to take a route that we don't like, but we should always have in our minds that there may be a different way of doing things, and it may be a shortcut for what Excel can do. Size matters. We don't want to bloat a spreadsheet with extra images or code or visuals that we don't really need. A lot of formula-driven development allows us to get away with things in a very lightweight way. So, Size matters on a spreadsheet. Think about it before you add the next control or before you make a list of new formulas that you may not necessarily need. And finally, I've discussed this before, but we're going to go more into it in this module, is the information transformation presentation dynamic.